Lily Pons was a French-American coloratura soprano whose sparkling voice and charming stage presence made her one of the most popular opera singers of the 1930s and 40s. She was a reigning star at the Metropolitan Opera for nearly 30 years, celebrated for her effortless-sounding high notes and her agile performances in operas like Lacom and Lucia di Lamore. Her fame extended well beyond the opera house. She starred in several Hollywood films, became a fashion icon, and was a beloved public figure. During World War II, she toured extensively to entertain Allied troops. Pons gave her final performance at the Met in 1960 and spent her later years traveling and living in Dallas, Texas. She passed away from pancreatic cancer in Dallas on February 13th. Though she became a proud American citizen, her final wish was to be returned to her birthplace. Her body was flown back to France, where she is buried in the Cimetière du Grand Jas in Cannes. Her gravesite is marked by a distinctive headstone featuring a large, artistic rendering of her first name, Lily, a final, elegant signature for a soprano whose voice was the essence of Gallic charm. Ezio Pinza was an Italian bass with a voice that was as rich and smooth as velvet. For 22 seasons, he was a pillar of the Metropolitan Opera, celebrated for his commanding stage presence and his acclaimed interpretations of roles like Don Giovanni and Boris Godin. He was a true basso cantante, able to sing with both imposing power and lyrical beauty. But Pinza achieved his greatest fame after he left the opera stage. He became a matinee idol and a household name by starring in the original Broadway production of Rodgers and Hammerstein's South Pacific. His performance of the song Some Enchanted Evening, if it made him a sensation, earning him a Tony Award and proving that an opera singer could conquer popular culture. He went on to star in other musicals and films. In his final years, Pinza suffered a series of strokes. He passed away on May 9, 1957 at the age of 64. Ezio Pinza is buried at the Holy Cross Cemetery in Stamford, Connecticut. His grave is marked by a simple, elegant family monument, an understated final resting place for a man whose magnificent voice captivated audiences on both the opera and Broadway stages. Born Rosa Ponzillo in Meriden, Connecticut, the soprano known as Rosa Ponsel possessed a voice that many critics and fellow singers considered to be one of the most beautiful of all time. It was often described as liquid gold, a sumptuous and velvety dramatic soprano voice of immense power and texture. After starting her career in vaudeville with her sister, she made a sensational debut at the Metropolitan Opera in 1918 opposite the legendary Enrico Caruso. She was just 21 and had never before set foot on an opera stage. For the next 2 decades, she was a reigning diva of the Met. She retired abruptly at the peak of her powers in 1987, never to sing in a staged opera again. She spent the rest of her long life at her opulent estate near Baltimore, which she named Villa Pace, giving private lessons and enjoying her retirement. Ponsel passed away from bone marrow cancer at Villa Pace. She is buried in the Druid Ridge Cemetery in Pikesville, Maryland, next to her sister Carmela. Her grave is marked by a simple bronze plaque, a modest tribute to a singer whose voice was pure opulence. Fyodor Chaliapin was a Russian bass who revolutionized opera with his towering stage presence and intense acting ability. He wasn't just a singer, he was a dramatic force of nature who inhabited his roles, particularly his signature part, Boris Godunov. His deep, powerful, and expressive voice, combined with his psychological insight, brought a new level of realism to the opera stage. He was a global superstar, one of the first great Russian artists to achieve immense fame in the West. After the Russian Revolution, Chaliapin's relationship with the new Soviet government soured, and in 1922 he left his homeland, never to return. He spent the rest of his life based in Paris, performing around the world. He died from a terminal illness in Paris on April 12, 1930. He was initially buried in the Batignolles Cemetery in Paris for decades. His grave was a politically symbolic act. The Soviet government, which had once stripped him of his honors, requested the return of his remains. In 1984, his body was exhumed and reinterred with great ceremony in the prestigious Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow, a final, dramatic homecoming for Russia's greatest bass. Dame Nellie Melba, born Helen Porter Mitchell, was Australia's first international superstar and one of the most famous women in the world at the turn of the 20th century. She was a lyrical soprano whose pure, silvery voice made her a leading star at London's Covent Garden and the Metropolitan Opera for decades. She was the quintessential diva, known for her perfectionism, her forceful personality, and her famous farewell performances, of which she made several. Her fame was such that the chef August Escoffier created 2 dishes in her honor, the Peach Melba and Melba Toast. She was a trailblazer, making some of the earliest gramophone recordings and hosting a pioneering radio broadcast. In her later years, she returned to Australia where she was a celebrated national figure. She passed away in Sydney on February 23, 1931. Her death was front-page news around the globe. She was given an elaborate funeral, and her body was transported for burial to the Lilydale Lawn Cemetery near her former estate in Coldstream, Victoria, Australia. Her large monument is inscribed with the farewell words of a character from the opera La Bohème Adieu senza rancor, farewell, without bitterness. Mario del Monaco was an Italian tenor who possessed one of the most powerful and thrilling voices of the 20th century. He was the definitive tenor di forza, or heroic tenor of his era. Known for his incredible vocal stamina and his electrifying high notes, his signature role was Otello in Verdi's opera, a part he sang an astonishing 427 times. His voice was a force of nature, often described as being like a bronze trumpet. He was a massive star in Italy and a leading tenor at the Metropolitan Opera during the 1950s. In 1964, he was in a near-fatal car accident that forced him to slow his career. He gave his last public performance in 1970. He spent his final years at his villa in Lansanigo, Italy, which he filled with mementos from his celebrated career. Mario del Monaco died from a heart attack. In a final dramatic gesture befitting his stage persona, his will stipulated that he be buried in his favorite Otello costume. He is interred in a monumental tomb at the Cimitero Centrale in Pesaro, Italy. Dr. Renata Tebaldi was an Italian soprano, beloved for the sheer beauty of her voice. While her famous rival Maria Callas was praised for her dramatic fire, Tebaldi was celebrated for her rich, radiant, and velvety sound. Her fans famously said she had the voice of an angel. She was a reigning star at Milan's La Scala and the Metropolitan Opera for more than 2 decades, specializing in the heroines of Verdi and Puccini. Her portrayals of roles like Mimkin La Bohème and the title role in Tosca were legendary for their vocal splendor and sincerity. The so-called Tebaldi-Callas rivalry, though often exaggerated by the press, was a defining story of the opera world in the 1950s. Tebaldi retired from the stage in 1976 and spent her final years in Milan. She passed away at her home in San Marino on December 19, 2004, after a long illness, at the age of 82. Her funeral was held at the Milan Cathedral, and she is buried in the family chapel in the Matoletto Cemetery in Langerano near Parma, the region where she grew up. It is a quiet resting place for a singer whose voice brought so much soaring beauty to the world. Born Belle Miriam Silverman in Brooklyn, Beverly Sills was the queen of American opera. She was a coloratura soprano whose dazzling vocal technique, brilliant acting, and bubbly personality made her an opera superstar and a beloved national celebrity. After years of building her career in regional houses, she became an overnight sensation in 1966 with her performance in Handel's Julius Caesar at the New York City Opera. She became the face of that company and later a star at the Met. Her fame extended far beyond opera. She was a frequent guest on television talk shows and even hosted her own program. After retiring from singing in 1980, she began a second, equally successful career as an arts administrator, becoming the general manager of the New York City Opera and later the chairwoman of Lincoln Center. A lifelong heavy smoker, she was diagnosed with lung cancer and passed away on July 2, 2007. In keeping with her famously down-to-earth nature, Sills requested that there be no funeral. She was cremated, and her ashes were interred in a private ceremony at the Kensico Cemetery in Valhalla, New York. Kirsten Flagstad was a Norwegian soprano who was widely regarded as the supreme Wagnerian soprano of the 20th century. She possessed a voice of immense size, beauty, and untiring stamina, perfectly suited for the demanding heroines of Richard Wagner's operas, like Isolde and Brunhild. She made a sensational debut at the Metropolitan Opera in 19, and for the next few years, she was a phenomenon, sparking a Wagner craze in New York. Her career was thrown into turmoil by World War II when she returned to her native Norway, which was then under Nazi occupation. Though she was cleared of any collaboration, her decision to remain in Norway with her husband, whose company did business with the occupiers, created a cloud of controversy that followed her for years. She eventually returned to the stage to great acclaim. Flagstad died from bone marrow cancer in Oslo on December 7, 1962. She was cremated, and her ashes are interred in an unmarked grave at the Vestergravland Cemetery in Oslo, Norway. This incredibly private and anonymous final resting place was her specific wish, a quiet end for a singer whose voice was a tidal wave of sound. Jussi Björling was a Swedish tenor whose voice was a thing of rare beauty. It was a silvery lyrical instrument with a distinctive, slightly melancholy tone that was perfect for the romantic heroes of French and Italian opera. He was a child prodigy who toured with his father and brothers in a vocal quartet. As an adult, he became a leading star at the Royal Swedish Opera and was a perennial favorite at the Metropolitan Opera from the 1930s until his death. While he was a somewhat reserved actor on stage, the sheer elegance and passionate sound of his singing made him one of the most beloved tenors of his time. Björling struggled with alcoholism for much of his life and was a heavy smoker. On September 9, 1960, he died of a heart attack at his summer home on the island of Säter in Sweden. He was just 49 years old. His premature death robbed the world of one of its most glorious voices. He was given a state funeral, and he is buried in the Stora Tuna churchyard in Borlänge, Sweden, a peaceful, rural setting for a singer whose voice could break hearts. Dame Joan Sutherland was an Australian soprano known to her admirers as the Stupendous One. She was a towering figure in the opera world, a coloratura soprano whose combination of vocal size, agility, and range was simply breathtaking. In the 1950s and 60s, she, along with her conductor husband Richard Boning, spearheaded the revival of the bel canto repertoire, the ornate operas of Bellini and Donizetti. Her performances in operas like Lucia di Lammermoor were legendary for their technical perfection and vocal fireworks. While some critics found her acting to be reserved, no one could deny the sheer magnificence of her instrument. She was a reigning diva at all the world's major opera houses for over 3 decades before retiring in 1990. She passed away at her home in Switzerland on October 10, 2010 at the age of 80. A small, private funeral was held, and in accordance with her wishes, she is buried in the Clarence-Vaux Cemetery near Montreux, Switzerland. She rests alongside her husband, Richard Boning, who passed away in 2020. A final reunion for the couple who changed the face of opera. Franco Corelli was an Italian tenor who had it all: a thrilling, powerful voice, movie star good looks, and an electrifying stage presence. He was the quintessential romantic hero of Italian opera during the 1950s and 60s. His voice was a magnificent instrument, famous for its clarion high notes and its passionate, ringing tone. He was a massive star at Milan's La Scala and the Metropolitan Opera, where his performances in operas like Turandot and Aida drove audiences into a frenzy. He was also known for his perfectionism, his legendary stage fright, and his sometimes fiery temperament. He retired from the stage in 1976, feeling that he could no longer live up to his own exacting standards. He spent his final decades in Milan teaching and living a very private life, rarely speaking about his career. He suffered a stroke in early 2003 and passed away in Milan on October 29th of that year. Franco Corelli is buried in the Cimitero Monumentale in Milan, one of Italy's most famous and beautiful cemeteries. He rests in an elegant tomb in the cemetery's Famedio or Hall of Fame, a fittingly grand final home for one of opera's most exciting tenors. Maria Callas was an American tenor who became a Hollywood superstar, bringing opera to a massive global audience. Born Alfred Kokotza in Philadelphia, he possessed a magnificent, natural tenor voice of immense power and passion. After a promising start in opera, he was signed by Hollywood's MGM Studios. His 1951 film, The Great Caruso, was a blockbuster hit and made him one of the most famous singers in the world. He was a pop culture phenomenon, but his career was plagued by a lack of discipline, battles with his weight, and a reliance on alcohol. He never quite managed to bridge the gap between his film stardom and a serious, sustained opera career. While living in Rome, his health rapidly declined. He died on October 7, 1959, from what was reported as a pulmonary embolism. He was only 38 years old. The tragic early death of a man with such a golden voice has been the subject of speculation ever since. Maria Callas is buried in the Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, California, a final resting place in the shadow of the Hollywood studios that made him a legend, and perhaps contributed to his downfall. Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale, was arguably the first modern international celebrity. She was a Swedish soprano whose pure, agile, and emotionally expressive voice captivated audiences across Europe. But her greatest fame came in 1850 when the master showman P.T. Barnum brought her to America for a nationwide tour. Barnum's brilliant marketing campaign whipped the country into a frenzy of Lind mania before she had even sung a note. The tour was a sensational success, making both of them incredibly wealthy. Lind was celebrated not just for her voice but for her virtuous character and her immense generosity. She gave a huge portion of her earnings to charity. She retired from the opera stage at the age of 29 but continued to give concerts for many years. She eventually settled in England, where she became a professor of singing at the Royal College of Music. Jenny Lind died from cancer on November 2, 1887 in Malvern, Worcestershire, England. She is buried in the Great Malvern Cemetery, overlooking the beautiful English countryside. Her grave is marked by an ornate stone cross, a tribute to the beloved nightingale whose voice once enchanted the world. Adelina Patti was the supreme diva of the 19th century. The Spanish-born Italian soprano was arguably the most famous and certainly the highest-paid opera singer of her time, earning thousands of dollars per performance, a fortune in that era. She possessed a near-perfect coloratura soprano voice, praised for its beauty, agility, and flawless technique. She was a global superstar who reigned over the world's opera houses for decades, after an immensely successful and lucrative career. She retired to a magnificent castle she owned in Wales, named Craigennis. The castle even included its own private, miniature opera house. She lived there in grand style, a queen in her own court. Adelina Patti passed away at her castle on September 27, 1919, at the age of 7. She was initially buried at her estate, but her final wish was to be laid to rest next to her favorite composer, Gioacchino Rossini. Her body was later exhumed and transported to Paris. She is buried in a prominent tomb in the world-famous Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, a final, grand stage for the woman who was once the undisputed queen of song. Enrico Caruso was opera's first modern superstar. The Italian tenor possessed a voice of incredible power, warmth, and passionate intensity that set the standard for generations to come. But his fame was amplified by a new technology, the gramophone record. He was one of the first major classical artists to embrace recording, and his records sold in the millions, making his voice famous in homes around the world. Far from any opera house, he was the undisputed star of the Metropolitan Opera for 18 seasons. His career was cut tragically short. While performing in 1920, he suffered a hemorrhage in his throat. His health rapidly declined, and he returned to his native Naples, Italy for treatment. He died there on August 2, 1921, from peritonitis caused by a burst abscess in his lung. His funeral in Naples was a royal event attended by thousands. Enrico Caruso is interred in a magnificent private chapel in the Cemeterio di Santa Maria del Pianto in Naples. For many years, his embalmed body was displayed in a glass sarcophagus for public viewing, a testament to the enduring myth of the man with the golden voice. Luciano Pavarotti was the most famous opera singer of the late 20th century, a man whose charisma and magnificent voice brought opera to the masses. The Italian tenor was celebrated for the radiant, sunny beauty of his voice and his effortless, ringing high Cs. He was a star at the world's great opera houses, but his fame exploded in 1990 when his performance of the aria Nessun Dorma became the theme song for the FIFA World Cup. As one of the three tenors alongside Placido Domingo and Jose Carreras, he played to sold-out stadiums, becoming a global cultural phenomenon. With his larger-than-life personality and his immense generosity, he was the ultimate people's tenor. In his later years, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He passed away at his home in his beloved hometown of Modena, Italy. His televised funeral was a major state event, attended by political leaders, rock stars, and adoring fans. Luciano Pavarotti is buried in the Montale Rangone Cemetery just outside Modena, in a beautiful white marble tomb within the Pavarotti family mausoleum, a final homecoming for the man who shared his gift with the entire world. Maria Callas was more than an opera singer. She was a legend. Known as La Divina, the Divine One, the Greek-American soprano redefined the modern opera star. She possessed a unique and powerful voice, but it was her supreme dramatic intelligence and her total commitment to her characters that made her revolutionary. She could transform a forgotten opera into a theatrical masterpiece. Her life offstage was just as dramatic, filled with triumphs, scandals, a famous rivalry with Renata Tebaldi, a tumultuous love affair with shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis, and a tragic decline of her voice. She spent her final years as a recluse in her Paris apartment, heartbroken and isolated. She died there of a heart attack on September 16, 1977. She was only 53. The story of her final resting place is as dramatic as her life. She was cremated, and her ashes were interred at the Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. Her ashes were stolen from the cemetery but were recovered weeks later. Fearing further desecration, and in accordance with what was believed to be her final wish, her ashes were scattered over the Aegean Sea off the coast of Greece. There is no grave, only a cenotaph in Paris, a final, mythic act for the woman who became the very soul of opera.